Outreach Israel News, June 2024. A Balancing Act. Taken from Torah in the Balance, Volumes 1 and 2. In the mid-2020s, when surveying the broad world of religion, the Judeo-Protestant tradition, far too many people you encounter are likely to be imbalanced and unstable than balanced and stable. When many believers from conservative backgrounds look at the condition of much of Christianity, to be sure, they see a train which is running hopelessly off track. A great deal of non-Orthodox Judaism, likewise, seems to be far more interested in aligning itself with the world. The negative forces of progressivism, wokeism, and affirming have wreaked unspeakable damage to those looking to the God of the Bible over the past several years. When many sincere believers have witnessed a great deal of this havoc, they have understandably wanted to make sure that they have turned to a strong ethical and moral foundation in the Tanakh scriptures or Old Testament. Indeed, it can be logically observed. Would we even be having some of the debates present about abortion or homosexuality if we had a better appreciation for the law of Moses? Probably not. In 2003, when Torah in the Balance Volume 1 was released, I closed this installment with the chapter entitled Toward Toropolis. The point I was trying to stress was based in Ephesians 2:11 through 13, and believers in Israel's Messiah all being a part of the Politeia, or Commonwealth of Israel. A polis, or city in the classical sense, also indicated a way of life in a society, and so Jewish and non-Jewish believers in Yeshua should see themselves as part of a society which looks to God's Torah as its constitution. To be sure, though, the instruction of Moses' teaching contains far more than just commandments and directions. It also includes foundational accounts of the creation, fall, flood, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Exodus, wilderness sojourn of Israel, and their arrival at the Promised Land. In the Jewish tradition, the Torah is an annual document to be considered every year. In much of today's Messianic movement, we read through the Torah portions not just for what they communicate regarding ancient Israel, but also for their significance regarding the ministry and work of Yeshua of Nazareth. And as obvious as it may be, it is fair to say that today, in 2023-2024, many of us are going to start reading the Torah, Tanakh, Old Testament, and indeed all of Holy Scripture, much more from the perspective of it containing warnings of mistakes not to be repeated. 1 Corinthians 11:11, Revised Standard Version. I think many people across the Messianic community today have a broad appreciation for the role that the Torah is to play as a foundation for their theology and understanding of God's Word. This hardly means that there are not continuing challenges. After 2 decades since Torah in the Balance Volume 1 was originally released, how much closer are we to the arrival of Toropolis? Do the men and women, Jewish and non-Jewish, of today's Messianic movement compose a body politic of those who appreciate Moses' teaching and embody its principles of love, justice, and holiness, so as to make a concentrated difference in the world? Or has some mention or usage of Torah more likely become a means to divide from one's evangelical Protestant brothers and sisters, and also others internally within the Messianic sphere of influence, creating sub-movements, factions, and cliques. A balanced walk of faith with the principles of God's Torah supernaturally implanted onto a new heart and mind via the power of the new covenant. Jeremiah 31, 31-34, Ezekiel 36, 25-27, Hebrews 8, 8-12, is hardly something impossible. Deuteronomy 30, verse 11, does direct, after all, for this commandment which I command you today is not too difficult for you, nor is it out of reach. New American Standard. Being a mature believer, able to balance a proper inward morality with various outward observances, is something I have been able to witness many Messianic people do properly. They want to please the Lord in their external actions, including major Torah observances like remembering the seventh-day Sabbath or Shabbat, the appointed times or Moedim, and eating a kosher style of diet. But also recognize the paramount importance of love for God and neighbor as the foremost of all the commandments. Still, because of limitations of much of our human condition and mortal agendas and opportunism being what they are, maintaining a balanced walk of faith tempered by the principles of God's Torah can be difficult. Did matters of Torah really take off? In the very early days of Outreach Israel Ministries, I remember how my stepfather, Mark Huey, in reviewing the unique circumstances of our family being called into the Messianic movement, held to the strong belief that everyone would want to do this. In his estimation, when looking at the biblical and historical evidence that the first followers of Israel's Messiah were Torah-observant Jewish believers, and non-Jewish believers within the sphere of influence of the Jewish community, why would anyone not want to live a Torah-obedient life like the Messiah? In his view, would this not maximize the blessings one would experience as a believer today? Would not any mature believer in the Messiah of Israel want to live the most like him? The fact of the matter is that throughout the 2000s to the 2010s, there was indeed an inevitable explosion of non-Jewish people similar to our own family, which found themselves considering things of Torah via a variety of circumstances, ranging from being exposed to concepts like Jesus in the feasts, reading Matthew 5, 17-19, or even wanting a better handle on Israel in prophecy. Many non-Jewish people found themselves entering into Messianic Jewish congregations, as we originally had in 1995. A wide number of these people are still a part of the Messianic movement today. Some, for any number of reasons, only lasted in the Messianic movement for a few years and returned to their previous church settings. Perhaps many more non-Jewish people, when entering into the Messianic movement, found themselves offended for any number of ways and/or were influenced by various spin-off sub-movements, most notably two house and one law or one Torah, and then eventually left. Unfortunately, a number of these non-Jewish people may have found themselves not treated as the equals of Jewish believers in Messianic congregations and synagogues, accelerating their departure. although each situation is obviously different. The 2000s to 2010s witnessed the emergence of what is today widely known as the Hebrew Roots movement. Various pro-Torah associations of non-Jewish people, although it is theologically witnessed that its beliefs and emphases are all over the board. Unlike the Messianic Jewish movement, which, despite some of its own challenges, still largely focuses on the mission of Jewish outreach, evangelism, and Israel solidarity. There really is no set mission of the Hebrew Roots movement. For sure, there are many sincere non-Jewish believers involved in the Hebrew Roots movement who have embraced their faith heritage in the scriptures of Israel. Yet, a great deal of the Hebrew Roots movement has stigmatized itself by being overly negative and condemning to the positive contributions of evangelical Protestantism and even the Jewish synagogue. In the mid to late 2010s, huge sectors of those identifying as Hebrew Roots were found to severely question, if not deny, the divinity of Yeshua, the status of the inspiration of the apostolic writings or New Testament, especially the Pauline epistles, and many Hebrew Roots advocates do support a flat earth, among other problematic issues. Many are anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist. Today, in 2024, the majority of the people you will see being involved with matters of Torah and who are non-Jewish are likely to be involved in some sector of the Hebrew Roots movement. While prophetically, it is true that the nations are going to stream to Zion in the last days and be instructed from Moses' teaching, Micah 4, 1 through 3, Isaiah 2, 2 through 4. How many of the non-Jewish people involved in Hebrew Roots were sincerely convicted by the Holy Spirit as a matter of their progression in the New Covenant, that various outward matters of God's Torah were important for them to consider? How many of them were tempered by a great love and burden for the salvation of the Jewish people and being co-laborers with Jewish believers in the redemption of Israel? Romans 15:27. How many more of them fell prey to sensational Christianity is pagan rhetoric and to substandard and harmful teachings not designed to truly edify believers in God's grace and mercy? Factional clashes. A great deal of the theological and apologetics challenges of the 2000s to the 2010s came from the massive influx of non-Jewish people into the orbit of things messianic. For sure, many non-Jewish believers were being legitimately called into the messianic movement. Little different than how the Moabitess Ruth declared, "Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." Ruth 1, 16b to 17a, Tree of Life version. These non-Jewish believers, while perhaps first entering into the Messianic movement via wanting to connect to worthwhile practices such as remembering Shabbat, Yeshua in the feasts, or study the weekly Torah portions, would also be seen to serve alongside of Jewish believers as co-laborers in Jewish evangelism and the salvation of Israel. Many others, however, would be seen to get involved in messianic things for other reasons. some more sensational than not, and contributed to the rise of spin-off movements such as Two House and One Law, One Torah. Not enough non-Jewish believers exposed to the Messianic Jewish movement realize this. But the Messianic movement was not originally set up as a Torah movement. The Messianic movement was originally set up as a community where Messianic Jewish believers could express their faith in Yeshua without having to give up on their Jewish heritage or traditions, as has been expected of them during the many centuries of Christianity. Yet, the first believers in Yeshua the Messiah were all Jews. The nexus of salvation history on this planet is Israel. Messianic Jewish congregations were to facilitate the mission of Jewish outreach, evangelism, Israel solidarity, and be places where Jewish believers could raise their families in an environment styled after the synagogue. As obvious as it may be, this would prevent assimilation and keep Messianic Jewish progeny Jewish. For sure, various non-Jewish believers would be expected to attend and be part of Messianic congregations. Many Messianic Jewish believers, after all, have non-Jewish spouses. Friends and allies of Israel have always had a place in the Messianic Jewish movement. Many non-Jewish believers have understood the original Messianic Jewish vision, but others have not. As an emerging spiritual movement, Messianic Judaism is hardly perfect, and it has gone through seasons of difficult growing pains. Not all Messianic Jewish congregations and fellowships are welcoming of non-Jewish believers, and a number of Messianic Jewish venues may be seen to treat non-Jews as second class. Issues of equality between Jewish and non-Jewish believers are likely to be present until the Messiah returns. Galatians 3:28. Various spin-off sub-movements were seen to arise, initially intending to be places where equality between Jewish and non-Jewish believers could be better manifested. The two-house sub-movement arose largely in response to the emphasis on physical Jewish identity, positing that the reason so many non-Jewish people had been drawn into the Messianic movement was because they were actually members of the lost tribes of the exiled northern kingdom of Israel, or Ephraim. Supporters of Two House wanted a physical connection to Israel too, but Two House quickly got mired in lost tribes speculation, tall tales, and British Israelism, as well as one major proponent supporting polygamy. Also answering the question of why many non-Jewish people have been drawn to things of Torah has been the One Law, One Torah sub-movement. It posited that non-Jewish believers should be approached as though they were gerim, or sojourners, outsiders who entered into the community of Israel and who were bidden some level of Torah observance. Deuteronomy 31:12. This was far less provocative than the claims of Two House, but the One Law, One Torah sub-movement has been stigmatized by a great deal of inflexibility, legalism, and in failing to recognize that native and sojourner in ancient Israel, while having more in common than not, were not 100% identical. To be sure, many leaders in the Messianic Jewish movement have issued disapproving statements and papers to these sub-movements. these white papers have raised many legitimate negative points, but on the whole, they have also made resolving some of the questions raised by two house and one law, one Torah much more difficult for those engaged in apologetics. And much of what was seen as two house and one law or one Torah in the 2000s, in the 2010s, got widely amalgamated together as the more generic Hebrew roots. The most significant focus of the modern Messianic Jewish movement is that it is a faith community which has decisively placed itself on the salvation historical trajectory of Romans chapters 9 through 11. As Romans 11, 25 through 27 so astutely summarizes, "For I do not want you, brothers and sisters, to be ignorant of this mystery, lest you be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the nations has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved, just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, he will remove ungodliness from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins." Isaiah 59, 20 through 21, Septuagint, Isaiah 27, 9, Septuagint, Jeremiah 31, 33 and 34, Psalm 14, 7. Romans 11, 25 through 27, author's rendering. While the Messianic movement has placed itself onto a Romans chapters 9 through 11 salvation historical trajectory, it will also have to doubtlessly reckon with other prophecies. Some of the most obvious of these are Micah 4, 1 through 3, and Isaiah 2, 2 through 4, which are traditionally recalled during the morning Shabbat service as the Torah is brought forth from the ark. It would be difficult to deny, in the mid-2020s, that the prophecies of non-Jewish people from the nations being taught from the truths of God's Torah are not taking place throughout the broad Messianic community. When actually fulfilled, these prophecies indicate how there is to be worldwide peace and absence of war. Unfortunately, the issue of non-Jewish believers and matters of God's Torah has tended to bring anything but shalom, and has more often instead fueled divisions, factions, mistrust, bitterness, and instability. People from all of the varied sub-movements mentioned are likely to be found attending Messianic Jewish congregations and conference-level events, certainly across North America. How we actually return to a better path where the original Messianic Jewish mission is being accomplished, and where non-Jewish believers can be properly equipped as co-laborers alongside their fellow Jewish believers, is not going to be easy. Yet, it is what I know many of us all recognize is required in order for us to move forward into the purposes the Lord has for us. What have we each given up? Recognizing this significant mandate, today's Messianic movement has been entrusted with by the Lord. It should not at all be surprising to witness how navigating around human limitations unnecessarily occupies a great deal of the Messianic person's time and energy. When we look back at what has taken place since the late 1960s to the present, we have indeed witnessed not only a generation of Jewish people come to faith in Yeshua as the Messiah of Israel, but they have been responsible for seeing Messianic congregations and synagogues planted across the world, as places where Jewish believers can believe in Yeshua and maintain their Jewish heritage. The Messianic Jewish pioneers have rightly seen fit to solicit evangelical Christian support of the Messianic mission of Jewish outreach, evangelism, and Israel solidarity. And, perhaps as an unforeseen consequence, many non-Jewish believers in Israel's Messiah have embraced their faith heritage in the scriptures of Israel in very tangible ways. Even with some of the tensions caused by the independent Hebrew or Hebraic roots movement, there are many thousands of non-Jewish believers who have been genuinely called and assigned by the Lord to serve alongside their fellow Jewish believers in the salvation of Israel in Messianic congregations. To be sure, it has to be recognized that in making a profession of faith in Yeshua as the Messiah of Israel, many Jewish believers have endured incredible persecution and ostracism. Many Jewish believers need a Messianic congregation or synagogue to be a place of refuge and solace where they can be among their fellow Jewish believers who have experienced some of the same hardships as they. Many Jewish believers' extended Jewish families certainly consider them to be crazy for accepting Yeshua, or may no longer consider them Jewish. Historically, Jewish people who have recognized Yeshua as Messiah are no longer considered to be Jews by much of the synagogue establishment. A great deal of evangelical Protestantism today, while often permitting scores of various ethnic denominations and churches, actually does not want to see Jewish believers in Yeshua have their own congregations which observe Shabbat, biblical and Jewish festivals, and perform life cycle traditions such as bar or bat mitzvah or brit milah, circumcision. Many Christians want Jewish believers to become part of the greater church community and assimilate, effectively disappearing from the scene. Messianic Judaism has been entirely right to establish its own communities for Jewish believers. There are many evangelical, non-Jewish believers who see the importance of Messianic Jewish congregations. While one might think that Messianic Jewish congregations and synagogues are to be places for Jewish people only, the fact of the matter is that a large minority of marriages taking place in conservative and reform Jewish settings are intermarriages, and non-Jewish people do frequent conservative and reform temples. Non-Jewish believers being involved in Messianic Jewish congregations, in many ways, parallels that of what is taking place in much of conservative and reform Jewish settings. With only a handful of exceptions I am aware of, on the whole, North American Messianic Judaism wants to simply stress whether or not a non-Jewish believer drawn into a Messianic congregation is truly called by the Lord to be there. The main purpose of the Messianic congregation or synagogue is Jewish ministry. Can a non-Jewish believer, while being enriched by his or her faith heritage in the scriptures of Israel, also be committed as a co-laborer in the Messianic mission? One of the things which I remember our family experienced back in the late 1990s was a seeming lack of reciprocation, as our family was fully committing itself to the Messianic movement and a Torah-observant lifestyle. We were properly asked as non-Jewish believers by various Messianic Jewish leaders to be sensitive to the needs difficulties, and hardships faced by Messianic Jews. Rejection from the Jewish community, dismissal from one's family, being regarded as no longer Jewish and now Gentile because of belief in Jesus. We were taught to be very careful with some of the English terms we might use from customary Christian jargon, such as cross or baptize, and instead employ alternatives like execution stake or immerse, because they might offend Jewish people. We were asked to be very conscientious of Christian anti-Semitism and be committed to a further education in matters of Judaism, Jewish tradition, and Jewish culture. And indeed, these were all completely understandable and justifiable. As non-Jewish believers, we were simply asked to put ourselves into the place of Messianic Jewish believers, be aware of the difficulties they faced in coming to Yeshua faith, and note the challenges which Jewish non-believers will have when they come into a Messianic congregation. The great difficulty we frequently experienced in our early Messianic days of 1995 and 1996 is that while non-Jewish believers in Messianic congregations were asked to recognize what Jewish believers have often given up in coming to faith in Yeshua, was that there was often little to no reciprocation with what non-Jewish believers have given up in becoming Messianic. When a non-Jewish believer enters into the Messianic movement, he or she will be seen to adapt a new lifestyle involving Shabbat, the appointed times, a kosher style of diet, and will be anchored to matters of Israel and the Jewish people. Many will leave established Protestant denominations for a still developing and still maturing Messianic movement, which can be too fundamentalist at times. Many will give up sacred family memories by concluding that traditional holidays such as Christmas and Easter were inauthentic to the first believers in the Messiah. Many will give up treasured family recipes because they contain pork or shellfish. Many single non-Jewish believers who enter into the Messianic movement or grew up Messianic because their parents brought them into it at a young age have great difficulty, because of the small size of this faith community, finding a compatible husband or wife. Being cut off from a great deal of the evangelical community and finding oneself in the Messianic community has a wide degree of tensions for non-Jewish believers. And that is why one has to often be uniquely called. While I know of many Messianic Jewish believers who recognize the difficulties non-Jews can have when entering into the Messianic movement, and will offer a degree of reciprocation for what families like mine have given up, this is not as frequent as it should be. Indeed, my family has chosen to stay Messianic when we have seen other non-Jewish believers not even last 3 years. Others, while seeing the value in being connected to and enriched by the Messianic movement, choose to do a kind of Messianic light. Staying an evangelical Protestant who regularly attends church, but who may seasonally attend a Messianic congregation at seasons such as Passover or the fall high holidays, or who may remember Hanukkah while still being firmly involved in Christmas. To be certain, each individual and family is different, but the difficulties non-Jewish believers face and being fully committed to a Messianic lifestyle need to be better recognized and appreciated by many more Messianic Jewish believers moving forward. What division are we witnessing now? It is unfortunate to say this, but many throughout the Messianic sphere of influence have indeed forgotten what the original call and purpose of the Messianic movement actually was. How many today, within the orbit of things Messianic, even bother to really mention the original mandate of Jewish outreach, evangelism, and Israel solidarity? Probably not enough. This is a missional vocation deeply rooted within the themes of Romans chapters 9 through 11, intending to answer the apostles' question, Lord, are you restoring the kingdom to Israel at this time? Acts 1:6, Tree of Life version. The fact that more is taking place than just the salvation of the Jewish people proper, with non-Jewish believers embracing their faith heritage in the scriptures of Israel, now the majority of persons within the Messianic movement have complicated things, but not unnecessarily so. Many of these people have been genuinely called by the Lord into the Messianic movement to serve as co-laborers beside Jewish believers in the salvation of Israel. But, being the majority, non-Jewish issues and challenges involving matters of Torah have too often eclipsed legitimate Jewish issues needing to be addressed. Some course corrections are going to have to be made in the not too distant future. Division, factions, rivalry, and mistrust are all unfortunate predicaments, perhaps worst epitomized by the situation Paul had to regulate in Corinth, 1 Corinthians 1, 12 and 13. Having one faction, group, or sub-movement break off are matters which have been witnessed throughout a great deal of religious history. Some division over major matters of theology can be necessary, i.e., dividing over a Calvinist or Arminian soteriology. But many divisions do not take place over theology, but over differences of personality. Because of its numbers, theological and spiritual divisions, which exist in a great deal of evangelical Protestantism, can be much more easily managed. There are a few evangelical denominations whose official numbers actually exceed the total number of Jewish people on planet Earth today, around 17 to 18 million. Today's Messianic Jewish movement, because of its minute size in comparison, cannot easily handle divisions and factionalism, because people will often quickly find out about new splits and groups forming. And the Messianic movement loves to talk. While not impossible, those serving in the field of apologetics have to carefully and diplomatically often learn to navigate and maneuver around some of the short-sightedness of the religious politics and spiritual culture too many have been harmed by. And what do religious politics and machinations actually do? They cause us to waste energy, resources, they weaken us, and they keep us away from the real work we should be performing for the kingdom of God. When you cannot fairly resolve a theological or spiritual matter within a faith community and a faction or schism erupts, those who were harmed are less likely to stand by you when a major, substantive attack hits. Today, as we enter into the mid-2020s, originally writing 27 November 2023, there are two old issues seen since the early 2000s which continue to divide and split far too many Messianic people. Has non-Jewish Torah observance really provoked Jewish people to jealousy? Romans 10:11 for Messiah faith. Not to the extent many think it has. This has often been because a majority of non-Jewish Hebrew rooters are more concerned about only outward matters of Torah minutiae, and not that concerned about being sensitive to legitimate Jewish struggles. How many Hebrew roots ministries and groups are actually seen to stand against anti-Semitism and support both Zionism and the State of Israel, doing things of Torah but not caring too much about what the Jewish community cares about, says a great deal. Romans 11:18-22. How many Hebrew roots groups have actually stayed silent in the face of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism when many evangelical Protestants have not? Is the identity of a Messianic Jew to be principally found in his or her Jewish ethnicity and heritage, or in who the Messiah of Israel is? Philippians 3:3-11. While the preservation and continuity of Jewish identity is doubtlessly important, the Messianic community has to be able to service a salvation historical mission of heralding the return of Yeshua the Messiah and second coming. Those who would want to see the Messianic movement become another formal branch of Judaism have completely missed the major vocation this faith community should all be about accomplishing. New issues and divisions are also starting to flare up, which have at the center of controversy the issue of non-Jewish believers and outward matters of Torah. 2020 to 2021 witnessed the rise of a new sub-movement, pro-Naumian Christianity. The term pro-Naumian simply means pro-law, and so technically anyone who has a favorable view of the Torah or law of Moses is a lowercase p pro-Naumian. But those who have specifically labeled themselves as capital P pro-Naumian are often a collection of former Hebrew rooters who recognize that the Hebrew roots movement has gone too far in much of its anti-Christian rhetoric, and that Protestantism has more of a positive legacy for Torah-positive people to benefit from than previously acknowledged. In particular, theological traditions which have looked to the Torah for moral and ethical guidance. Another group, also composing pro-Naumianism, are those who have identified as one law or one Torah, but have now chosen to have very little to do with Judaism or mainstream Jewish traditions. While it is appreciable that pro-Naumianism wants to eschew the anti-Christian culture of much of Hebrew roots, how favorable pro-Naumianism is going to be to Judaism and matters of modern Israel is likely going to be a huge question. If formal pro-Naumianism does not take firm stances against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and demonstrate some degree of positivity to the Messianic Jewish movement, then it is likely to have various claims of supersessionism or replacement theology lodged against it. Speaking entirely for myself, I think that the emergence of pronomian Christianity has made things more complicated than not, with a new sub-movement coming onto the scene. At least a few sectors of the Messianic Jewish community are beginning to positively sort through that huge numbers of non-Jewish believers compose formal Messianic Judaism, often making up the majority of persons in Messianic Jewish congregations and synagogues, and also being included in local leadership. While many, I believe, recognize non-Jewish believers as their equals in Messiah and spiritual allies, and are mainly concerned about whether such persons are genuinely called by the Lord into the Messianic movement. Others are going to be seen to manifest various insecurities and believe that their uniqueness as Jewish people is being infringed upon. In 2021, it was claimed by some others in the Messianic Jewish movement that by non-Jewish believers doing outward things of Torah like Shabbat or the Feast of Tabernacles in anticipation of the future, Isaiah 66:23, Zechariah 14:16 and 17, that they were holding to an overly realized eschatology and doing things to be only reserved for the future, subsequent to the second coming of Messiah. While issues of whether a non-Jewish person is genuinely called by God into the Messianic experience are legitimate, the claim that millennial kingdom prophecies should stay entirely constrained to the millennium has a major problem to it. Various prophecies of the future kingdom also entail the riches of the nations streaming to Zion, partially because of restitution for wrongs and atrocities committed against Israel. Isaiah 45:14, 60 verses 5 through 17, 61:6, Micah 4:13, also Tobit 13:11, Apocrypha, 1 QM 12:13 and 15, Dead Sea Scrolls. Theologians have often recognized these expectations as forming the basis of Paul's collection offering mission. Romans 15:25 and 26, 2 Corinthians 8:13 and 14. And many of today's large Messianic Jewish ministries definitely use Tanakh, Old Testament, prophecies of the wealth of the nations streaming to Zion to promote their own fundraising endeavors. Does this need to stop until the millennial kingdom as well? Of course not. The claim of overly realized eschatology may indeed be seen to be based in some Messianic Jews' insecurity and an unwillingness for many to step up and be part of a truly end-time move of God, turning away allies of Israel when they do not have to. As obvious as it may be, the old issues and the new factions do very little to facilitate stability, trust, and mutual respect, Romans 12:10, in the body of Messiah. Instead, they are seen to induce tensions and cause theological brush fires in constant need of being extinguished. They take one's time away from being able to focus on major, controversial matters for which the Messianic community is poorly prepared. Among other things, 2020 to 2023 has seen the emergence of wokeism across both Judaism and Christianity, and with it, millennials and Generation Z being largely influenced by a hyper-progressive and liberal ideology. Young people are going through a process of what has been labeled as deconstruction, which, while on paper is to involve the inclusion of new and marginalized persons and perspectives, in practice largely involves radically purging a conservative theological and spiritual framework. If today's Messianic movement purports to have a Torah foundation for its theology, focused around its fulfillment in Messiah, Matthew 5:17 through 19, then we should seemingly be more than ready to implement its principles of holiness and righteousness, having the answers to the legitimate questions posed by wokeism. Unfortunately, we have been spending too much of our time being sidetracked and distracted by those with particular agendas and insecurities. We largely do not have the big picture view of what the God of Israel is doing as we think we do. A balancing act. The very purpose I released a Torah in the Balance Volume 2 was to address the importance of various outward practices of God's Torah. The Lord desires that His people be whole, first in terms of their inward heart morality, Matthew 5:8, and secondly, in terms of the whole human being, 1 Thessalonians 5:23. There are many mature men and women in today's Messianic movement, Jewish and non-Jewish, who were able to balance a stellar inward morality with appropriate outward actions. They recognize the centrality of the work of Yeshua the Messiah to their personal identity and can properly fellowship as one in Him in mixed diaspora Messianic congregations, representative of the one new man or humanity, Ephesians 2:15. They are committed as brothers and sisters in Yeshua to the salvation historical trajectory of Romans chapters 9 through 11, being active in matters of Jewish outreach and evangelism, and in seeing non-Jewish believers partake of their faith heritage in Israel's scriptures, as a matter of their further growth and sanctification. In the year 2024, there are many true Messianic believers who are able to have a balanced, Torah-observant walk of faith. Their obedience to God's Torah is resultant of the work of the New Covenant, Jeremiah 31:31 to 34, Ezekiel 36:25 to 27, in their lives. Yet some of this has not come without some growing pains, or even seasons of severe spiritual correction from our Heavenly Father. Some of us are immune to having gone through periods where we have had to admit to various mistakes, make corrections, and testify to how the Lord used various difficulties to improve our effectiveness in His service. We possibly find ourselves in what may be a very disconcerting time for the broad Messianic movement. Many of the challenges of the past continue to plague us. The baby boomers and those of Generation X, while helping to build the Messianic movement, have not been too willing to recognize and properly address the challenges faced by millennials, Generation Z, and now Generation Alpha. In the future, more of the controversies involving the Torah will concern significant ethical and moral issues debated by institutional Judaism and Christianity, and less of the identity matters the Messianic Jewish pioneers had to sort through. I do believe that with God's help, today's Messianic people will be able to perform the work and divine assignments which He has for us.